They didn't bother lowering their voices. "She doesn't even know what she owns," one of them laughed, tapping a folder against the polished table. Another smirked. "She barely knows what day it is." The woman standing across from them heard every word. She stood still, hands folded neatly in front of her, dressed in black. Not theatrical black, not dramatic, just the quiet kind that had become her uniform since the funeral. Her face showed nothing, no anger, no confusion, no protest. That was what irritated them the most. They were sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of a financial services building that overlooked the city, a place designed to intimidate, to remind people who held the power. And right now, the people seated around the table believed the power belonged entirely to them. She was, in their minds, an administrative inconvenience, a widow who had outlived her usefulness. The meeting was supposed to be quick, procedural. That was how they had framed it in the email: asset clarification and transitional documentation. Neutral words, safe words, words that made it sound like this was for her benefit. But the mood in the room said otherwise. They spoke about her as if she weren't there. Her husband handled everything, one man said, flipping through documents he clearly hadn't read very carefully. Accounts, companies, investments. She never touched any of it. "She won't understand most of this," another added. "We should simplify, keep it basic." A woman at the far end of the table leaned back in her chair. "Basic is generous. I'd be shocked if she even knows the difference between personal and corporate assets." A ripple of quiet laughter followed. The widow lifted her eyes, just briefly, and looked at the stack of folders in front of them. Each one labeled, each one color-coded, each one representing something they believed they controlled. She said nothing. That silence again made them comfortable. People who think they're in charge always mistake silence for ignorance. The meeting leader, a man who introduced himself with his full name, title, and credentials, as if reciting a resume were an act of dominance, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale," he said, finally acknowledging her existence, "we're here to help you understand what remains and what doesn't." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward her. "This document outlines the assets you are entitled to retain," he continued. "The rest will be transferred according to previously established structures." She glanced at the paper. Just one page. That alone told her everything. Her late husband had never done anything with just one page. "I see," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, clear, steady. The man nodded, relieved. "Good. Then this should be painless." He gestured toward the others. "We've already done most of the work. You won't need to worry about details." Another mistake. She didn't ask questions yet. She didn't challenge them. She didn't correct their assumptions. Instead, she looked at the names on the folders. She recognized some. Others, she didn't, which was exactly what they were counting on. "Do you have any questions?" the meeting leader asked, already stacking papers as if the conversation were over. She paused, just long enough to shift the room. "Yes," she said. "Who prepared these records?" The question caught them off guard. The man hesitated. "Our firm compiled them based on information provided by your husband over the years." "Which years?" she asked. A subtle change in tone. Still polite, still soft, but precise. He frowned slightly. "The most recent filings." "How recent?" she pressed. Someone chuckled. "Mrs. Hale, this level of detail isn't necessary. You can trust—" "I'm sure you believe that," she replied, her voice even. "But I didn't ask who I should trust. I asked how recent the records are." Silence this time belonged to them. The man cleared his throat again. "The last comprehensive review was 3 years ago." She nodded. 3 years. That explained the missing folders. She leaned forward slightly for the first time. "And the entities formed after that?" she asked. Blank looks. One of them flipped through his folder, suddenly less confident. "There shouldn't be any." She didn't smile. "There are," she said simply. The room shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A woman across the table frowned. "I'm not seeing anything like that." "I didn't say you would," the widow replied. Her calm was unsettling now. She sat back, folded her hands again, and said nothing more. They recovered quickly, or thought they did. "Well," the meeting leader said briskly, "regardless, what matters today is what you currently own." The word own hung in the air. They enjoyed that word. It implied authority, finality. She doesn't even know what she owns. Someone muttered again, this time with less humor and more irritation. The widow stood, not abruptly, not defiantly, just stood. "I'd like copies of everything," she said, "including historical records." "That won't be necessary," the man replied. "It will be," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time. Something in her gaze made him hesitate. He forced a smile. "We'll see what can be arranged." The meeting ended shortly after. They escorted her out with polite smiles, satisfied that nothing had changed. As the elevator doors closed, one of them laughed. "She's harmless." They were wrong. In the lobby, she paused near the reception desk. "Excuse me," she said softly to a young assistant. "Could you tell me where your records department is?" The assistant hesitated. "That's restricted." "I understand," the widow replied. "Who oversees it?" The assistant glanced around, lowered her voice. "Mr. Calder, 3rd floor." "Thank you." The elevator ride down felt longer than the one up. On the 3rd floor, the atmosphere was different. Less glass, more paper, quiet. Mr. Calder was older than she expected, grey-haired, tired eyes. The kind of man who had spent decades watching numbers tell stories people tried to hide. He looked up when she entered. "Yes?" She introduced herself. His expression changed, not to pity, not to dismissal, but to something sharper. Recognition. "I wondered when you'd come," he said. That stopped her. "You know who I am," she said. He nodded. "Your husband asked me to keep certain files off the main system." Her pulse remained steady. "Did you?" she asked. He stood, walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out a thick binder. "I kept everything," he said, "because I had a feeling this day would come." He opened the binder. Inside were records the others had never mentioned. Entities, holdings, accounts layered beneath trusts and subsidiaries. Her husband's handwriting appeared in the margins. Not instructions, warnings. Mr. Calder looked at her carefully. "They think you don't know what you own." She closed the binder. "They're about to find out," she said. And somewhere above them, in a glass-walled conference room, people were still laughing, unaware that the records they ignored were already moving against them. The people on the 32nd floor slept well that night. They had no reason not to. From their perspective, the situation was contained. A widow had been informed of her limits. A paper trail had been reduced to a single page. Control had been reasserted. The system, as they understood it, was working exactly as designed. What they didn't know was that systems fail quietly first. On the 3rd floor, the widow sat across from Mr. Calder as he spread the contents of the binder across the desk. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the scent of things meant to last longer than people's memories. "These weren't accidents," he said, tapping a page. "Your husband structured them intentionally. Layers, redundancy. He didn't want everything visible at once." She studied the documents carefully. They weren't dramatic. No bold headlines, no shocking numbers on the first page. Just dates, entity names, registration codes, the kind of information that looks meaningless until you know exactly what you're looking at. "They told me there was nothing formed after 3 years ago," she said. Mr. Calder let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "That's because they stopped looking after that." He slid another page toward her. "This holding company," he said, "controls 5 subsidiaries. 2 of those subsidiaries control the real estate trusts they just told you were no longer active." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And the others?" "Private equity positions, off-market, quiet." She said nothing. Silence again. But this time it wasn't passive. It was calculating. Mr. Calder watched her closely. "They don't know you're here." "No," she replied. "And they won't. Not yet." He nodded. "Smart." She gathered the documents carefully, returning them to the binder. "I need copies," she said. "Certified. That can be arranged. And I need to know who has access to the main system." Mr. Calder hesitated. "Everyone upstairs," he admitted. "Partners, senior advisors, compliance." Her lips pressed together briefly. "Then we move slowly," she said, and quietly. Upstairs, the narrative was already being rewritten, without her. An internal email circulated the next morning. "Subject, Hale Estate. Status update, client has been informed of finalized asset scope. No further action required at this time." The language was clean, professional, definitive, and completely false. At a long table, the same group from the meeting skimmed the message and moved on. One of them chuckled. "Told you, she didn't even push back." Another leaned back in his chair. "They never do." A third added, By the time she realizes what she's lost, it'll be too late. They believed this because it had always been true before. They had done this many times, widows, heirs, silent partners, people who trusted the wrong version of events. What made this one different was that she wasn't trying to stop them. She was letting them continue. 2 days later, she requested a follow-up meeting. The request annoyed them. "Already?" one of them scoffed. "What now?" The meeting leader frowned. "Probably confusion, or second thoughts, or regret," someone said. They always regret not asking questions sooner. They scheduled the meeting for the end of the week, not out of urgency, but out of obligation. They would humor her, reassert control, close the loop. In the meantime, the widow made quiet visits. She spoke with a retired accountant who had once worked under her husband, a compliance officer who had left the firm years ago under unclear circumstances, a former board secretary who remembered meetings no one else wanted to remember. She asked careful questions. She never revealed what she already knew. Each conversation added a piece, not a single dramatic revelation, but a pattern of omission, a pattern of convenience, a pattern of people assuming she would never look closely enough to notice. By the time she walked back into the glass conference room, she knew exactly where the cracks were. They greeted her with polite smiles again. "How can we help today?" the meeting leader asked. She sat. "I've reviewed your summary," she said. He nodded. "And I'd like to discuss 3 entities that weren't included." The smiles faltered. He blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." She placed a printed list on the table. Names, dates, registration numbers. Not dramatic, but accurate. The room went quiet. One of them reached for the list, scanning it quickly. These aren't relevant." "They are," she said calmly. "They were formed under my husband's authority and remain active." "That's not possible," the woman from before snapped. "They would have appeared in the system." "They didn't," the widow replied, "because they weren't designed to." The meeting leader straightened. "Mrs. Hale, with respect, this is getting into territory that you don't control," she finished. The temperature in the room dropped. They exchanged glances. Someone laughed nervously. "This is exactly what we were talking about. She doesn't understand how ownership works." She leaned forward. "I understand it very well," she said, "which is why I'm asking who authorized the omission." Silence. No one answered, because answering would mean admitting something they couldn't explain. The meeting leader recovered first. "We'll look into it," he said sharply. "But until then, the existing documentation stands." She nodded. "Of course," she said, and then she stood. "As long as we're clear on one thing," she added. "Nothing is finalized." He frowned. "That's not accurate." She met his gaze. "It is," she said, "because the records you're relying on are incomplete." She left without waiting for a response. Behind her, the room erupted. "What the hell was that?" one demanded. "Where did she get those names?" "Someone is feeding her information." The meeting leader's jaw tightened. "Find out who." On the 3rd floor, Mr. Calder was already being questioned. Discreetly. Too discreetly. A compliance officer stopped by under the pretense of routine review. "Have you accessed any files related to the Hale estate recently?" she asked. Mr. Calder didn't flinch. "I access records every day. That's my job." "Anything unusual?" "Only the fact that some people seem nervous," he replied. The officer smiled thinly and left. The widow knew then that time was shortening. They were becoming aware, not of the truth, but of the threat. That was enough. She made one final request. Not to them, to the bank. A formal appointment, documentation review, and a confirmation of representation. The email response came back within hours. "Your request has been forwarded to the regional manager. Please attend the scheduled review next Tuesday." She read the message once, then closed her laptop. They still thought she didn't know what she owned. They still believed the records were on their side. What they didn't realize was that records don't lie. People do. And very soon the difference would matter. The bank building had no windows that opened. Everything about it was designed to feel sealed, insulated from weather, emotion, and unpredictability. The kind of place where decisions were made quietly and consequences arrived later. The widow arrived 10 minutes early, not because she was nervous, but because she understood something the others didn't. Institutions respect punctuality more than power. She wore the same understated coat she had worn to the funeral. No jewelry, no colors that demanded attention, nothing that suggested conflict. To the receptionist, she looked exactly like what they expected her to be. "Name?" the woman asked, barely glancing up. She gave it. The receptionist paused, looked again, typed something into the system, then straightened. "One moment, please." That was the first shift. She was escorted not to the waiting area, but to a private room. Glass walls, muted lighting, a long polished table. Within minutes, 2 people entered. One was younger, carrying a tablet and an expression that tried too hard to stay neutral. The other was older. He didn't introduce himself immediately. He sat across from her, placed his folder on the table, and studied her face for several seconds longer than was polite. "You requested a records confirmation," he said at last. "Yes. For entities linked to the Hale estate." "That's correct." He nodded slowly. "I'm Richard Vaughan, regional manager." The title mattered. She inclined her head slightly. "Thank you for meeting with me." He didn't respond to the courtesy. Instead, he opened the folder. "I'll be direct," he said. "Your request triggered several internal alerts." She didn't react. "These entities," he continued, sliding a page forward, "are unusual." "In what way?" she asked calmly. "They're layered," he said. "Intentionally opaque, not illegal, just hidden." She folded her hands. "My husband believed in privacy." Mr. Vaughan looked up sharply. "You knew about these?" "I knew he believed in redundancy," she replied. "He didn't trust single systems." That answer landed. The younger assistant shifted in his seat. Mr. Vaughan exhaled slowly. "The problem," he said, "is that your financial advisors appear to have submitted summaries that exclude these structures." "Yes," she said. "They told me they didn't exist." "That's difficult to explain." She tilted her head. "Is it?" He met her gaze now. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence. Professional silence. The kind that means something irreversible is being acknowledged. Mr. Vaughan closed the folder. "I need to ask you something very carefully," he said. "Did you authorize anyone to act on your behalf after your husband's death?" "No." "Did you sign any documents transferring control?" "No." "Did you waive any rights?" "No." Each answer landed harder than the last. He nodded once. "Then we have a problem," he said. "And not yours." Outside that room, phones were already ringing. A compliance officer was pulled into an emergency call. A junior partner received a message marked urgent. An internal note flagged the Hale estate as under review. And upstairs, in the same glass conference room where laughter had once filled the air, confusion began to spread. "What does this mean?" one of them demanded, staring at his inbox. "It's just a verification," another said quickly. "Routine." But his voice lacked conviction. A third leaned forward. "Why would the bank escalate this without notifying us?" No one answered. Because no one wanted to say the truth out loud. Downstairs, the widow listened, as Mr. Vaughan explained the next steps. "A temporary hold will be placed on any actions tied to the entities in question," he said, "until ownership is clarified." She nodded. "We'll also need to notify your advisors." "That won't be necessary," she replied. "They already know." He paused. "They don't." She met his eyes. "They will." By the time she left the building, the narrative had already fractured. Emails were being rewritten, calls were being returned late, meetings were being postponed, until further notice. And the people who had once joked about her ignorance were now discovering the cost of assuming silence meant surrender. The meeting request came that afternoon. Urgent, marked time-sensitive. They wanted to see her immediately. She declined. Instead, she sent a single line in response. "I'm unavailable until records reconciliation is complete." The reply was almost instant. This delay could have serious implications. She read it, then closed her phone. They were right. Just not in the way they thought. That evening, Mr. Calder visited her apartment. He looked different now, alert, tense. "They've started asking questions," he said. Not politely. She poured tea. "Good. They suspect someone inside is cooperating." She handed him a cup. "Someone is." He hesitated. "They may try to pressure you." "They already have." "They may try harder." She met his gaze calmly. "Then they'll make more mistakes." He studied her. "You knew this would happen," he said. She didn't deny it. "What I didn't know," she said quietly, "was how quickly fear replaces confidence." The next day, the council convened an emergency session. Officially, it was to review estate discrepancies. Unofficially, it was to contain damage. She was not invited, which told her everything she needed to know. Inside the room, tempers flared. This is getting out of hand. We should have shut this down earlier. She's manipulating the bank. No, one voice snapped. The bank is following the rules, that's the problem. The meeting leader slammed his hand on the table. We need leverage. What leverage? Silence. Because the leverage they had assumed existed, her ignorance, her grief, her silence, was gone. A message arrived later that day. Not from them, from the bank. Records review scheduled. Full disclosure meeting to follow. She read it slowly. This was the point of no return. They could no longer quietly erase her. They would have to face the records, and the records were patient. That night she stood by the window looking out over the city. Lights flickered on and off in distant offices. Somewhere above her, people were pacing, arguing, rewriting strategies that no longer worked. She felt no satisfaction, only clarity. They had laughed because they believed ownership required noise. They had mistaken restraint for weakness. They had assumed that if she didn't speak, she didn't know. But knowledge doesn't announce itself. It waits. And very soon it would be read aloud. The room was larger than the others, designed not for comfort but for witnesses. Glass walls on 3 sides, a long table at the center, microphones embedded into polished wood, cameras discreetly mounted in the corners, not for drama but for documentation. This was where records were read when they mattered. She arrived exactly on time, not early, not late. When she entered, the conversation stopped. The council members sat on one side of the table, arranged carefully like people who had practiced authority for years, and suddenly weren't sure it still belonged to them. Their advisors were present, legal counsel, compliance officers, and at the head of the table stood Richard Vaughan. He did not smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady, formal. "We're here to complete the records reconciliation." She took her seat. No hesitation, no nerves, just presence. A screen behind Vaughan lit up. "Before we begin," he continued, "I need to clarify something for the record." He turned slightly toward her. "Mrs. Hale did not request this review lightly. The bank initiated a full audit after discovering material inconsistencies between internal summaries and primary records." One of the council members shifted in his chair. Another cleared his throat. Vaughan tapped the tablet in his hand. "Let's start with ownership." The screen changed. Entity names appeared, unfamiliar to most in the room, complex, layered. "Each of these," Vaughan said, "is a holding structure tied to the Hale estate." A council member interrupted. "We've already established those are dormant." Vaughan looked at him. "No," he said. "You established that." The screen shifted again. Ownership percentages, control clauses, signatory authority, and at the bottom of each page, the same name, her name, not transferred, not delegated, not waived. A murmur rippled through the room. Vaughan continued, unflinching. "These entities control assets currently valued at approximately—" He paused, checked the figure. $312 million. Silence fell like weight. One of the advisors laughed nervously. "That can't be right." Vaughan didn't look at him. "It's conservative." The laughter stopped. A council member leaned forward. "Those assets were never disclosed." "They were disclosed," Vaughan replied calmly. "Just not to you." He turned to her now. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "would you like to explain?" She stood, slowly. Every eye followed her. "I didn't hide anything," she said. "I assumed the people responsible for managing my husband's estate would read the documents he left." She glanced around the table. "I see now that assumption was a mistake." One of them spoke sharply. "You expect us to believe you didn't know the value of these holdings." She met his gaze. "I knew what mattered," she said. "I knew where the authority was." She paused. "I didn't know how much you underestimated me." That landed harder than any number. Vaughan resumed. "Based on this review," he said, "the bank has determined that multiple actions taken over the past 6 weeks were unauthorized." He looked directly at the advisors. "Funds were moved without consent. Control was misrepresented. Records were summarized selectively." One advisor stood abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding." Vaughan raised a hand. "No," he said. "This is documentation." The screen changed again. Emails, internal memos, time-stamped approvals that traced decisions back to the same small group. A pattern, deliberate, calculated. The council leader's face drained of color. Vaughan spoke again, slower now. As a result, all accounts tied to these actions are frozen pending investigation. A sharp intake of breath. Furthermore, he continued, the bank is formally referring this matter to federal regulators. Someone whispered, "You can't do that." Vaughan didn't respond, because he already had. She sat back down. Her role was finished. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about consequences. The meeting dissolved shortly after, not with shouting, with quiet panic, phones buzzing, people leaving early, eyes avoiding hers. As she walked out, Mr. Calder caught up to her in the corridor. "They didn't see it coming," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "They thought ownership was loud." Outside, the city moved as it always had. Cars passed, people hurried, life continued. But inside that building, something had broken. 6 months later, the headline was brief. Estate advisors under federal investigation following asset misrepresentation. No names, no drama, just facts. 2 firms dissolved within weeks. A council member resigned for personal reasons. New policies were quietly implemented, and the Hale estate stabilized, protected, untouched. She spent most mornings now in her garden, the one place where nothing needed to be explained. Occasionally, someone would recognize her name, ask how she managed it, how she stayed so calm. She always gave the same answer. "I read what was left to me." And when she thought back to the laughter, the jokes, the certainty in their voices, she felt no anger, only a kind of clarity. They didn't lose because she fought. They lost because they assumed she didn't know. And knowledge, when written down, doesn't disappear. It waits. If this story reminded you never to underestimate quiet strength, leave a like and subscribe. There are more truths like this waiting to be told.